Sheila Fischman is an award-winning translator of some 200 contemporary novels from Quebec. That translates into about 15 million words, apparently. And she has worked on books from such authors as Roch Carrier, Michel Tremblay, Hébert, Marie-Claire Blais, and Jean Chrétien. She has received the Governor-General's Literary Award for French to English translation and the Molson Prize in the Arts. She is a member of the Order of Canada and a Chevalier of the Ordre National du Québec. She lives in Montreal, Quebec, in the Plateau neighborhood. Welcome to the Bibliophile.
I'm very happy to be here. Thank you.
So Mordecai Richler wrote about the Plateau. Did you ever translate any of his work?
Well, 2 points. He doesn't write about the Plateau. The part of Montreal that he writes about is now called, I think it's called Mile End. It's a little west of where we are here.
Because St. Urbain Street is
That's
just
right.
like 2 blocks over.
Yes, it's 1 block west. Where Mordecai Richler lived was about 3 blocks north of here.
So there's a line?
For purposes of Montreal electoral districts, I would say that he's from Miland.
Okay.
Because when he was growing up, the Plateau Montreal, as it was known at the time, was a poor neighborhood, as poor as the neighborhood where he grew up. Since then, people have taken advantage of the large apartments and the proximity to so many things, and it's just the most wonderful part of Montreal, except for the Jean Talon Market, which is my absolute favorite part of the city.
Yeah, I love it too. Well, you translated Michel Tremblay's work, quite a bit of it, and he wrote about the Plateau, correct?
Yes, when Michel Tremblay was living, well, he's back in the Plateau now, actually, but when he was growing up, it was kind of poor. There were large French-Canadian Catholic families with all kinds of kids, and the apartments tended to be triplexes with lots and lots of rooms, including a double living room, a salon double, they were called. Now they're being lived in by CBC people and writers and yuppies of various kinds.
Just looping back to my Mordecai Richler question, you don't go from English to French then. You're French to English.
Most people, I don't know, 95% maybe of translators work into their first language, their mother tongues.
Yeah.
There are some people I know who can go in both directions, but it's pretty rare.
And there's an article that you directed me to, written by Derek Webster, a profile of you in the November 2017 issue of Walrus magazine. So I just want to quote from that, if I could.
Of course.
In August 1968, a chanteuse Qubcois named Pauline Julien was dancing in a pink miniskirt atop a dining room table. F.R. Scott, a poet and eagle-nosed constitutional lawyer, 30 years her senior, held her steady. As Julien twirled the gathering of artists, writers, and their spouses, including painter Marion Scott, poet Gérald Godin, and memoirist and occasional pornographer John Glasgow, laughed and cheered, the booze was having its effect. Can you tell me about that party?
Oh, God. The party that changed my life and the lives of a fair number of people, I think.
Because it was held at your house, right?
Yes, I lived in the house where it took place.
In North Hadley, Quebec, which is about an hour from east of here, right?
I was married to Doug Jones, D.G. Jones at the time, who was a poet, a great poet. And I had been in North Hadley for only a few months. I didn't really know the place or the people. But when I first arrived there, I noticed something that struck me as extremely weird. It was a center for pottery making. There was an important studio there where pottery techniques were taught, and it was one of the sort of many drawing points of North Hatley. Anyway, there was an exhibition of pots by a few potters with French names, and another exhibition by a few potters with English names. North Hatley was a village of 500 people, and it struck me as extremely bizarre that there should be this kind of division. Surely these people have things to say to each other.
So these were separate exhibitions at separate times throughout the year?
Well, one major one during the summer. I was aware, although I hadn't really met them yet, I was aware that there were a certain number of poets around, Anglophone and Francophone. And I thought, well, they apparently don't know each other or not all that well, because I've been making some inquiries. So why don't I organize a poetry reading with everybody, which I did. Little bit of social history. There was the SAQ, the government liquor commission, was on strike. So I don't know, there was not even any beer around, and people were thirsty. Mm-hmm. And my little sister, who was approximately 4 feet 10, came down on the train from Toronto with 2 huge suitcases that clinked, and she had basically filled them up with whatever she could lay her hands on. This was a most welcome contribution to the party, because I had everybody over for dinner before the reading, and people started consuming and enjoying it and getting drunk.
That sounds about right for a bunch of poets.
Yeah, it was exactly the expected behavior, and everybody was fine. Then we moved over to a place called The Pottery, which was the place where the pottery lessons were given and the exhibitions were held. And it also contained the living quarters of a wonderful woman named Mildred Baudin, whose ex-husband was one of the big-name potters in Quebec at that time. So we all staggered over to the pottery.
Right.
And I had asked our next-door neighbor, who was also a professor at the University of Sherbrooke, in Comp Can Lit, as we call it, Comparative Canadian Literatures, French and English. And Ron was totally bilingual, and I asked him if he would be so kind as to be the MC.
Ron
Sutherland.
Okay. He's not related to John Sutherland, is
No. He began his introduction, welcome, it's good to see you all, blah, blah, blah. And he started in English. Not the end of the world, I wouldn't have thought, but Pauline Julien was being sort of wicked. And she started sort of hissing, en français, en français. And she did and did not mean it, okay? And other voices joined in. They were getting louder. Ron Sutherland was able to tone them down, and the reading proceeded, although there was a certain amount of unwelcome background noise. So anyway, the evening got kind of rough. There were some people who stomped out. There were some people who didn't speak to some people from the other language group, the other political group, who had been their friends.
Well, just because of that, or I guess the alcohol, what?
Well, I think the alcohol loosened tongues.
Yeah.
You know, I don't mean to make it sound like some huge rowdy.
No.
In 1968, if you remember, that was the year René Lévesque left the Liberal Party, and I think he had already founded something called the Mouvement Souveraineté Association, MSA.
The FLQ crisis was only 2 years later, right?
The FLQ crisis had started in the early 60s. That was when there were mailbox bombs.
Okay, but the crisis itself was 1970, right?
Yeah, the October crisis started in October of 1970 with a kidnapping, eventually another kidnapping and murder. It was a horrible time.
So this party, though, it basically opened your eyes, didn't it?
It opened my eyes to just how powerfully strong the political feelings were and how powerfully strong the language question was. I don't know why. It didn't bother me much one way or another. Possibly because when I moved to Quebec, my project was to learn to speak French, basically. And I wanted to speak French. I wasn't being pushed by any organization or relatives or anything like that. I wanted to be able to speak to the people who I lived among. So I couldn't share in the horrified actions and reactions. But I'm just thinking back to some of the people who met for the first time that evening, who became close over the years, Anglo and Franco. And while there were people who stopped speaking to old friends, there were other dyads, other couples were formed, let's say.
Which is what you wanted.
It was exactly what I wanted. So in the end, I was not unhappy with the evening.
Did it spur you then to learn the language and start translating? What kind of clicked there? Because the first book that you translated was also in 1970, right?
I just take me back a few years. I'd studied French in high school and in university, and I got good marks. And I loved the language. And of course, in Toronto, I didn't have occasion to speak French in those days, or even more important, to hear French being spoken outside the classroom. And it was frustrating when I arrived in Quebec because I did have these tools.
This aptitude.
And the aptitude, yeah. And I guess it was Doug Jones who suggested to me that if I really wanted to immerse myself in the French language, I should try translating something. And I remember asking him, what could I translate? Because I knew nothing. And I remember that he suggested a famous short story by Hébert called Le Torrent, which I read or tried to read, and it was way, way, way beyond my knowledge, my ability. So I didn't follow through on that one, but then I met Roch Carrier, and he had just published his first novel, La Guerrière, and his wife, who spoke English, Roch didn't really at the time, but Diane told me that it was written in simple French and I wouldn't have trouble with it. Her idea of simple French was not the same as mine, but I decided to sit down and try to translate it, which I did. I was happy with the result.
Were you still in North Hatley at that time?
Yeah, I was still in North Hatley then.
Okay.
So I sent it around to 3 or 4 people. I really couldn't tell you who they were. I mean, 3 or 4 publishers, and nobody was interested. And then I was really cut off from the Toronto literary scene by then. Bill French, did you know him?
Didn't know him, I know of him.
He
at the Globe, the books editor?
Yeah. He's the person who gave me my first break.
Won't forget him.
One
then.
of those. No, he was a wonderful man. Mm-hmm. Told me about a new press called the House of Anansi, and I sent it to them. And long story short, they accepted it and published it, and it became a bestseller. And it was talked about an awful lot because of an accident of timing. It came out just around the time of the October Crisis. And at its core, there is a very grave misunderstanding between Anglophones and Francophones. And a number of columnists, reporters, I don't remember who they all were, talked about this book as providing some of the answers to what does Quebec want. And in a sense, I guess it did.
What were those answers?
Oh boy, that's a very good question that I'm not sure I have an answer. Quebec wants recognition. Quebec wants the ability to live in French, to have its culture recognized and respected, and ultimately it wanted to be an independent country, which, it practically is.
They've got,
We've got everything.
You got the best of both worlds, really.
Yes.
But maybe that's not good enough. I don't know.
I don't know. The PQ, the Parti Québécois, barely exists anymore.
Mm-hmm. What about that book, though? What came out of that book?
La Guerre?
Yeah, La Guerre. Yes, sir. Yeah. That was actually the 10th book that Nancy published.
Yeah.
Did you deal with Dennis Lee at all, or?
Sure, I dealt mainly with Dennis, and some with Dave Godfrey.
That must have been. What was that like?
Oh, well, it was terrific. Dave knew French. He had spent a year in Aix-en-Provence. Lucky man. But he wasn't as involved in this particular book of Anansi's as Dennis was. And it was Dennis who made or suggested editorial changes.
He's renowned for having written copious notes around the text. I don't know if that happened with you or not.
No, it didn't, because you can't really do that with a translation because, in a sense, the book already exists.
And you
can't make major changes.
You can't veer too far, no.
Right.
And he didn't know the original, so.
No, Dennis, well, he's picked up a fair amount of French since then, but at the time, it was ideal for me, actually. I really prefer it when an editor I'm working with doesn't know a word of French.
Yes.
Because then they can't say, well, you've said reddish blue here, and I think should be bluish red, and, sort of imposing their taste on me, which doesn't make me very happy. Anyway, that it is, alas, a fact of translation life nowadays, as more and more people become fluent in French, which is a good thing.
Getting back to the book itself, is that the one where he cuts his hand off to escape?
That's right, to escape conscription.
Right.
And it's the dead of winter. It's extremely cold, so presumably it freezes solid practically as it hits the axe. Well, the first scene in the book is Joseph cutting off his hand, and then we see kids playing hockey with the hand.
Oh, goodness.
Yes. Funny and cheerful and tasteful and all that.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's how it begins. Well, it taught me, it was grotesque and exaggerated and so forth, but in the final or maybe the penultimate scene, when the body of the local boy who was killed in the war is brought back to the village, he's brought back by, 4 or 6 other soldiers.
English soldiers, right?
Yeah, they're Anglo and they don't speak a word of French. And the village is appalled and horrified, and the soldiers are befuddled. That, on a larger scale, and, as a sort of comedy, was, I guess, the situation for a lot of people, a lot of Francophone people who worked in the bush or who worked in factories and were doing rather menial jobs and answering to an Anglo boss with whom they couldn't speak. That sort of example has been cited again and again and again. In many cases, it's exactly accurate. In other cases, it's blown up until it makes no sense. But the fact remains that for a very long time, and until, 30 years ago maybe, the floors were swept by Francophone Quebecers, and the checks were written by Anglophone Quebecers or Canadians.
Mm-hmm.
And it was pretty rough. There was also, around the same time and in parallel, the Catholic Church was very powerful in the province of Quebec. The church made the rules, and people had to follow them.
Well, they really pushed having lots of kids, didn't they?
Yep.
Even though this wasn't the wish of certainly many women.
But many women followed what Father had told them to do. Mm. And, we hear of grotesquely large families of 8 or 10 or more children.
And there's a real resentment against the church because of that.
It's really interesting. I wasn't living in Quebec, and I wasn't able to read French at the time, so my knowledge of it is limited. But in 1961, when the Liberals under Jean Lesage won the election, turfing out Maurice Duplessis, who, I should add, was under the grip of the church as well, and vice versa. And when he was turfed out of office, they call it was an Anglo journalist who first used the phrase, the Quiet Revolution. And the church was just turfed out of its formerly powerful position. This is a sort of analysis of my own that might be totally wrong, but I don't know. It's what I believe happened.
Well,
the church was replaced by nationalism, by the independentist party. But now another generation has passed, and as we were saying earlier, I believe that we are virtually independent. And that party, the original independentist party, has practically just fallen off the map. It's been really interesting to live through that.
You've probably read more Quebec novels more closely than anyone else on earth. And you read really, really closely because that's what a translator has to do. So you would probably have a better idea of what the, quote, Quebec identity is. A better idea than anyone.
Thank you. That's a very generous compliment. I'm not sure if I can live up to it. Certainly the books that I have translated, I've read very carefully because you have to, or you're not doing your job. You can't do your job. There's another generation coming along who I don't know and whose work I don't know. There was a review, I think it was in the Globe on Saturday, on the weekend, of a novel called The Dishwasher by a young guy. I can't remember his name. I haven't read his novel, but it's set in a sort of greasy spoon type restaurant, as I understand. Don has read it, but I haven't. But he's part of a new generation whose novels tend to have an urban setting.
He's based in Montreal, is he?
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
Okay.
And as I say, I can't remember his name, but he's been translated, that novel's been translated by another young guy named Pablo Strauss, who is apparently just a brilliant translator.
So what you're saying is you certainly did have a good idea of what the Quebec identity was, but are you saying that you're losing touch with that, or maybe it's changing now?
No, it's changing now.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry to keep harping on this, but I believe that it is related to what I consider to be virtually the realization of that dream of independence. I don't know what, I was going to say, I don't know what some of my sovereignist friends would say about that. But then I was trying to think of who my sovereignist friends are. And I don't think any of them, any of my politically interested or engagé friends, are sovereigntists anymore, except Jean-François Lisée.
Well, and also Michel Tremblay certainly is.
Well, Michel, not so sure.
It sure came out when I talked to him.
When was that?
That was about 8 months ago.
Isn't that interesting? He spoke strongly in favor of an independent Quebec.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well. Because at other times in the not-so-distant past, he's talked about Parti Québécois has had its moment. It's time to move on.
Maybe, yeah, or maybe he just feels that he's getting old and it's not his fight to fight, so probably that's part of it, too.
That's probably part of it. And he lives outside Quebec for 6 months of the year, too.
Yeah.
But, no, we never, I've never talked with him about politics, strangely enough. That's very interesting, though. He would be the only one I can think of who still has that discours, who still talks that way about independence.
You've said that reading a novel in another language brings you together, brings the two nations, if you will, or cultures together.
Yes, I think it does.
Is that part of what motivated you to start doing this?
It happened along the way. As I said earlier, the main reason I started translating or trying to translate was to learn the language.
Right.
And I really wasn't thinking about publication at the time when I was doing it. Mm-hmm. But at a certain point I had read it for the umpteenth time, and I realized that it was a very interesting novel and it might be of interest to people other than me. And that was how it began. But the Quebec identity that you were asking me about, when I was first being exposed to it and learning a little about it, I guess the people and the writers were not that far removed from the country. Native-born Montrealers were, in my circles, if I can put it that way, were a minority. Their references, in many cases actually, there were references that I could share because I grew up not on a farm, but in a very small village in Ontario. Mm. And I didn't have all the things that my Francophone friends from the countryside didn't have either. And so it was kind of shared past that facilitated getting to know each other. Jacques Poulin, who's not as well known as I wish he were, but he's a marvelous writer. And it's funny, he grew up in a village not far from where Roch Carrier comes from. And his father, like mine, had a general store in this little village, and we've compared notes, and we had the same chores to do in our father's store, this kind of thing.
Right.
And knowing that about him created a kind of bond, because we spoke the same language and put the same cans of baby food on the shelves on Sunday afternoon, that kind of thing. But I still haven't answered your question about the Quebec identity, have I?
No.
No.
Well, I think you've talked about the desire for respect and the freedom to live in your own language.
And your own culture.
And your own culture. And to basically have your own nation. And that seems to some extent to have been answered. So that maybe is why we don't have the tension that we used to have.
I have to say I have occasionally been appalled at the ignorance of some very well educated Francophone Quebecers, or I should say Québcois, about the rest of the country, and still about Canada, the rest of Canada. There was one who I won't name who told me that she had recently met someone from Newfoundland, and they had been talking about history and politics and blah blah. And she said to me afterwards, "Do you know, they have a lot of the same problems that we do. They have a lot of the same wishes and hopes that we do. They didn't really want to become part of Canada." And she was, this PhD, was just startled. That's simply an anecdote. It's not, I'm telling it not because I think it's representative of anyone or any group, but I was surprised.
Well, I was going to keep this powder dry until the very end, but it brings up the question of the fact that, especially when you talk about writers and literature, the total ignorance of the English about Quebec literature and Quebec about English literature. They might know Aunt Margaret Atwood, but that's about it. And so my question is, does that disappoint you after you've spent your life trying to change this?
I think it is changing. I think it has changed and it continues to change. Yes, Atwood. Yes, Tremblay, Carrier. But more and more they're being spread around. I mean, this review that I was talking about, although I can't remember which paper I read it in.
Yeah.
Was it the Globe?
I think it was. I saw a reference to it as well. And
it was a half-page review.
Yeah.
And when does this happen?
Well, especially for translating.
And a translation, yeah. But I have to say, we translators have done a good job of waking up journalists and publishers to the facts of life in translation.
Well, the fact that you want your name on the front cover for a
start. Yeah, that was a hard fight that we won, and then Anansi, who published very good books, decided that having our names on the cover meant that people would see that it was a translation and they wouldn't buy it or read it because they don't like translations. But if they left our names off the cover, then they would read the book and they might look at the title page and see a translator's name. But I mean, it's dishonest and it's insulting. Yeah, very insulting. So it goes. There's only one other Canadian publishing house that I can think of that does that, as a matter of course.
That doesn't put a translator.
That doesn't, refuses to put the translator's name.
To this day. Okay.
It's a relatively new, it's small-ish publishing house out of Quebec City, and they publish pretty well only translations, good ones. Many, if not most of them, by the guy who owns the press, and that worries me a little. But the standards are high, and what they publish is good. But all these francophone writers presumably write in English. The fellow who owns it and runs it and does a lot of the translations is he's a Brit. His name is Peter McCambridge. I don't know if you've.
He's out of Quebec City?
Yeah.
But he publishes in
English, in Quebec City.
But he doesn't put his name on the front of it then?
No.
He just... keeps that
No,
quiet.
I assume they're on the title page. I think it has to be.
But not on
certainly
the
on the
cover.
reverse, on the copyright page.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Okay.
he might be an interesting person to talk to
Mm-hmm.
if you're looking for
Yeah.
more.
Well, actually,
about
what
Quebec.
I'm most interested in, and we can turn to that now, is your skill and talent and practice of translation. And you discuss it in an essay in a book called Luminous Ink. The essay is called Why. Luminous Ink is published by Cormorant Press. You say that translation requires obsessiveness and humility. Maybe you could expand on that a bit.
Obsessiveness, certainly. You have to be so interested in and curious about every word in the text that you're translating. And this can mean that you have to spend a week, 2 weeks, coming up with an equivalent translation of a word or a phrase in the other language. It can mean the same kind of obsessive traveling around the place where the book novel is set. And I'm not talking about Sri Lanka or somewhere far away. I'm talking about 2 neighborhoods over. Yeah, I remember the day I walked over to Michel Tremblay's neighborhood, Fabre Street, and the places that he describes in his novels are still there.
No, that's
And
great.
I was thrilled. Oh, it's that kind of obsessiveness, I think. There's also the kind of obsessiveness that can have you rewriting a sentence or a paragraph over and over and over until you're finally you have to let it go, and you should be feeling fairly satisfied with it by then. I'm just going to tell you something that's totally unrelated, and if you don't mind, can I? I've just started reading the biography of Leonard Cohen by Sylvie Simmons.
Mm-hmm.
Have you've read it?
No, I haven't. I've picked it up and I've thought hard about reading it, but I haven't yet. Actually, I wanted to read it in advance of that great exhibition they had here.
Yeah.
Which I really liked.
The biography is terrific. I recommend it highly. But one of his friends, Morton Rosengarten, is interviewed at some length, and there are many quotations from him. And early on in the book, he's talking about how Leonard approached his writing this is when he was starting to do music. He says that whatever he's learning to play on his guitar and sing, whether it's the Red River Valley or who knows what, he will play it and sing it again and again and again for days and days and weeks. It could drive you crazy. And then he goes on to say, and it's the same with his own work. He can spend 4 months on a lyric because he has to redo it 20,000 times. I think that kind of obsessiveness is very healthy, as long as you're not driving your best friend crazy. But I think that is necessary for the kind of work that we do.
What about the humility?
Oh, God, I don't know if I have it or not. You can't launch into a translation with the idea in mind that, oh, this is a piece of cake. Of course I can do it. It'll take me X weeks. I think the humility I'm talking about has to do with the fact that you're going to run into problems, difficulties, dilemmas that you can't solve. You're going to have to call on other people, linguists, the author, somebody else.
Can't do
that
it
you
all
can't
on your
necessarily do it on your own.
Mm-hmm.
I must say, though, that when it's finished and it's a book and out there in the world. If someone writes about it in the Quebec Standard or the Globe and Mail or wherever, it's really nice if the reviewer says something about the translation, especially something complimentary, I must say.
Well, listen to this. This is, you've heard it before, but it's such a good line. Gaëtan Soucy, he was asked once, why do you write? And his response was, to have the pleasure of rereading myself a year later in Sheila's translation. That's why he writes.
Oh, he was such a wonderful writer and a very dear friend. And he died, 5 years ago now, I think.
Speaking of death and Leonard Cohen, I'll just quote this from your essay, Why? Always it is a matter not only of meaning, but equally important of rhythm, of the musicality of a sentence. It sounds right. And you talk about petite musique in my translation. I aim to keep that little music. So you read your I know I do that when I write material. It's like I always read it out loud.
Yes.
Do you always do that?
Yes.
And you talk about that music, but is it just sort of, and I know what it means to me, but to you, is it just, it's difficult to explain. It just sounds right.
It has to sound right,
yeah.
Exactly. It's,
okay.
Excuse me, it's impossible for me anyway to explain what it is, but that's exactly it. It has to sound right.
Later on, you talk about swear words in French and the fact that the best translation would be no translation at all.
Did I say that?
Yeah.
No kidding. I wonder what I was talking about.
Well, I think it's just very difficult to translate Asti de Calice de Tabernacle.
Yeah, the Bethels of the Altar, as a colleague of mine once called them.
Yeah, it's like you don't want to translate that. It's such an important part of the language, isn't it?
It's an important part of the language, an important part of the culture. Carrier uses it, that kind of cursing, a lot in his early novels. You know, of the novels I've been reading and translating recently, I have to say I might see the odd Asti in a dialogue, but that kind of cursing that was so popular a generation ago is hardly ever used. And you know why? Because using those holy words in another way was an attack on the church. Or spitting in the face of the Pope, if you want. Yeah. And that's no longer an issue.
Isn't that interesting? It just seems to have calmed down. It's not at a boiling point anymore. And there's right. Because some of it, I mean, it's really aggressive. Like it's motherfucking son of a whore.
Yeah.
That's what they mean when they use these religious vessels. Yeah. It's just so incongruous, isn't it? And it's so disrespectful, which, as you say, is what they were expressing. So you'd say that the anger has been taken out of the atmosphere.
It seems to me, right. Although you've just told me that Michel Tremblay was speaking quite firmly.
Yeah, I'm going to have to listen. I can send you that interview. Actually,
I'd very much like to hear that.
Yeah, because as I say, it just really struck me that he was still angry. That's what I sensed. Yeah. Now I might have misread it, so I'll need to go back and listen to it again.
Well, he has different personalities.
That's right. We all do.
Yeah.
We all do.
Yeah.
But he may have been putting on a show for the English audience, perhaps. Who knows? It's
possible.
Yeah. We all do that.
Yes.
I'm different with you than I am with my wife or my daughters, or same with you, obviously.
Yes.
So we are a whole bunch of different personalities within.
Speaking of humility, I like my anecdote at the very beginning of that essay, Me and the Rocket.
Oh, yes, him asking why. Yeah. Yeah, and in fact, we haven't mentioned the hockey sweater, which is probably...
please, let's not.
Let's not, okay, but it's the most famous Roch Carrier work.
It's, if you don't mind me correcting you, it's pronounced Carrier.
Carrier, sorry, yeah.
It's okay, everyone does that.
Yeah. Yeah, I was just being English.
It's legal.
Yeah. Yeah. No, but I don't want to insult anyone or get it wrong either.
No, I'm obsessive.
Yeah.
Also.
Okay, so you think the explanation for this aggressive swearing and connecting it with the sacred is really just a real animosity toward the church itself, which has sort of expanded itself.
I can't remember where he says this, but I did read a comment, I think it was by Roch Carrier, but it might have been someone else. Someone wrote that the people who used that kind of ecclesiastical vocabulary as curses were the first Quebec revolutionaries. And I think that's reasonable.
Well, they were the ones that were most directly affected by the policies of the church and most harmed by it.
Yeah. Jean Chrétien comes from a family of, I think, 14
something
children.
Like that. He's one of the youngest, yeah.
Translating him was really fun.
Oh, was it?
Don and I did it together.
Okay.
And we worked together well, but Chrétien himself was just a sweetheart. He only had Don's phone number, so he tended to call him 2 or 3 times a week. Say, well, have you read such and such an anecdote? Did you like it? Was it funny? Did your wife like it?
So he was wanting to please them.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Speaking of your husband, Don Winkler, he used to work at the NFB.
That's right.
But in more recent years, he too is an award-winning translator.
Oh, he's a brilliant translator. He's won 3 GGs. 2 of his translations have been shortlisted for the Giller.
Okay, so my question is, what differentiates your translations from his translations?
That's a very good question. I would hope that the end result would be the same. I think we both have the same concern for, let's say, accuracy and call it music. Our tastes in reading are quite similar. We don't read all the same books, but many. His taste in material to translate is quite different from mine. First of all, he translates poetry, which I don't.
Yeah.
I think you have to
be a
poet.
Yeah.
Which I'm not.
But the actual work itself, I'm trying to get if there's something that differentiates the. I think you're saying the goal is the same for sure. You want to preserve as many traces of the original voice as possible.
Absolutely. Without writing dialect English. He works faster than I do. Interestingly, I do an awful lot more research than he does. This could mean that he's far better informed about a lot of things than I am. But I think
it's all in his head, you mean? So
I think it means that he's not quite as interested in certain things as I am, and so he doesn't feel that he has to probe it because, what's there on the page is what matters.
Mm-hmm.
This is probably one of the things that makes him faster. But no, he's a real polymath. He also has translated a number of difficult works of nonfiction, which I haven't done for quite a while, quite simply because I'm lazy. I don't want to have to do all that kind of scholarly research. I'm not a scholar, and when I was closer to my university years, I guess it didn't disturb me so much, but I don't want to live that way now, frankly.
I mentioned voice. How do you capture voice?
Oh. You try some words, and you try some others, and you go back to the first. On my computer monitor at the moment, I have, I think, 3 stickies. They're all attempts to write a description of something in nature. I'm giving myself 4 words to do it. And they keep changing, but I guess that's kind of what you do when you're attempting to capture a voice.
It's just trial and error, you think?
Trial and error, and speaking the words out loud.
And what? Obviously, hearing a voice in the original. That's,
oh yes. Yes.
But what different kind of voices are there? There's.
Well, I could say take the voice of Anne Hébert and the voice of Gaëtan Soucy, and it's as if they're writing from different planets.
What's different about the voices? Is one kind of light and gay and happy, and the other more strident and angry and loud, or?
Anne Hébert's novels, I'm not talking about her poetry now, which I think is quite different, but I don't talk about poetry. Her novels are often very dark, but they're not melodramatic, and her prose is very sparing. And that's one of the reasons I like translating her work so much, because, in a perfect world, if I were ever a writer, I would want to write with as few words as possible, which is why I have those stickies on my monitor. Gaëtan Soucy, on the other hand, writes about, creates a lot of violence, a lot of horrifying violence. His way of writing is a very, for the most part, we're not talking about the little girl who was too fond of matches, that's something else.
Yeah.
But his novels are written in a very classic, even elegant French. But he uses those tools to create something so very different from any other Quebec writer I know or know of. The little girl who was too fond of matches is really, really interesting. It was a sensation in French because it begins for the first about half of the novel. It's a first-person narration, and for the first half of the novel, the narrator's voice is male. It's very easy to suggest that in French because it's a gendered language, and so the pronouns and the agreement of the adjectives and so forth tell you are reading away, and this voice is telling you, this about my body and that about my body, and you start thinking, I think this is a girl talking, and eventually she comes clean and she is a girl. But the brilliant way in which he develops that in French is breathtaking. In English, it was a hell of a job because, of course, it's not gendered. And I had to avoid, as much as I could, I had to keep the secret until a certain point in the novel. Oh, my. sorry.
No, that's interesting.
I've been thinking about him a lot recently because it's around this time of year that he died.
Okay. Speaking of great work, and this might put you on the spot here a bit, but who's the best? Who's the most interesting? Who's the most entertaining Qubcois writer that you've ever translated, so that I can go out and read him or her?
That's not as difficult as you probably expect. I think that Michel Tremblay is one of the world's great writers. And I will go further and say that he could be Canada's second Nobel Prize. His work is that rich and deep and broad and unique. There are, of all the other writers I've translated, there are many who are really, really fine writers. I think they all are, or I couldn't translate them if I didn't feel that they were really fine.
Worthy of all the effort you put into it.
Well, yeah. I have to live inside the head of whoever I'm translating, and I want it to be preferably comfortable, but at the very least it has to be interesting.
Yeah.
I have to learn things.
That's exactly the definition of what I want when I'm reading something.
Well, my friend Phil Stratford used to say that translation was the deepest form of reading. I quote him all the time. I don't know if I did.
You
in
did.
That essay.
You quoted him to end it off, and you said that translating a book is by far the most detailed and profound and intimate way of reading it. And then you say, I translate for that reason and for the pleasure of going deeply into a text, a sentence, a paragraph, a chapter, a book, searching for what lies behind the words. I don't know what that means.
I'm not sure I do either. It's a phrase that came to me one day. I mean, literally, I can tell you where I was standing when it hit me in the brain. You know, if I wanted to be helpful, I guess I would say that, well, it's something like that kind of delving that I've been talking about all the time.
It's a beautiful quote, beautiful phrase.
Thank you. I've used it a lot.
Just finally, although I'm not sure I want to leave it on this note, but you were very empathetic and sympathetic to the separatist cause, but you at one point came to the realization that they weren't really focused on the little person that needed to be taken into account, and that's why you didn't vote to separate.
I think this is a reference to the last referendum, the referendum in 1995. I think I did vote PQ a couple of times. I don't really remember. I'm a lifelong NDP, and I usually vote NDP.
I just wanted to touch on this concept of pure lane, which is not really around anymore. There's much more of a kind of a North American outlook, a worldliness.
We still use the word pure laine, ironically, but among friends as a joke.
Yeah, but what explains this Bill C-21?
Oh God, I have no idea.
What in the Quebec identity? Because apparently it's quite widely supported. What is it that allows them to trample on human and religious rights?
It is very popular among the misguided individuals who voted for François Legault. A lot of his supporters come from rural ridings. They've probably never seen a hijab or a kippah in their lives, but they're afraid of them.
Is this reflected in Quebec literature that you translate at all?
Not that I've encountered, no. I mean, basically, Bill 21, I believe, was formulated and put out there and passed and is now law to hold on to those rural voters. It's his majority.
So it's not part of the Quebec identity then?
I don't believe so. It's not typical. I don't know. I don't watch television, although we've got that big thing there. We don't turn it on.
Mm.
And I think a lot of people see TV news reports about this attack or that disaster and...
Or immigrants coming in.
Oh, God, yes. Immigrants who are not respecting our language and our religion, even though we've left the church, and who have their own sets of belief that we don't understand, and they're scary. I think this comes from fear, not from hatred.
Okay.
But again, it doesn't. I'm not an expert.
Yeah, okay. And it doesn't really show itself in what your work at all.
On the contrary, recently, in the past couple of years, I've read, 4 or 5 new novels by younger writers in which central characters have been Jewish or Muslim, and the authors of these books have obviously made an effort to become deeply familiar with these cultures, these foreign cultures, as far as literary excellence is concerned. Some are better than others, but it's there, this curiosity about les autres. Mm-hmm. Les autres used to be, get them away from me.
Yeah.
But I think we, autres, are becoming interesting.
Well, it's kind of conflicting message here, because les autres seems to be behind or fear of them is behind this bill.
I know.
Yeah.
But they're geographically as well as ideologically so far from here. You'd said something about my sympathizing with the separatist cause and so forth.
Yeah.
During the campaign before the last referendum, I did all the French to English translation.
For the separatists?
For the we people,
right.
I called them.
Mm-hmm.
I have friends who told me, they didn't quite say that I was a traitor, but they were very unhappy to know that what I was doing was making some writing available to people who couldn't read it in the original.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
you're educating people.
Well,
you weren't
sharing knowledge.
Proselytizing, you were...
No, I was saying, look, here's what they're saying.
Yeah.
It's up to you. And as the campaign proceeded, things were going really well for them. And it seemed a foregone conclusion that the we was going to win. And I remember thinking to myself, oh, well, hell. It's going to happen. It might happen in 6 months. It might happen in 2 weeks. But let's just get on with it. Do it and get on with it. And so I was going to vote we. A few days before the election, I had to go down to the we headquarters on Papineau Street to translate something that was top secret. And I did it, and then I was walking home. It was a cold, blustery day. And I passed a church that had a soup kitchen with people lined up waiting for it to open. And what they were serving at this soup kitchen to these people, mostly old, and God knows what they'd had to eat that day, they were serving them a cup of cocoa, and that was it. By the time I got home, I was in pretty bad shape. And a couple of days later was the vote. And I've been thinking about this so much, going over mentally all this stuff that I'd translated. some that I'd even helped write. And there was nothing in any of that that made any kind of reference to those people. So I said to myself, no, I can't do it. So I voted no, and it was such a close call.
Yeah, your one vote really did help, didn't it?
Well,
made a difference.
Yeah, for once, single votes did.
Yeah.
But now there's not going to be another referendum. François Legault has promised that there won't be. But I think that sort of energy that went into the sovereignist movement, I think it's pretty well fizzled. There is a newish political party. It's quite left. It's sovereigntist. Any of the people I know who were really strong independentists tend to be talking about voting for this party.
Just to finish off, it seems to me that the whole of your career has been spent trying to get the two cultures to understand each other better and to get together as opposed to separating. You say that's fair?
Yes. Yes, that's fair. I don't believe that, we'll use the old-fashioned term, which you don't use anymore. The separatists, they weren't demons, you know? Mm-hmm. They didn't want to set off bombs in the Edmonton Mall. They wanted what they thought they wanted at a certain historical period. I was in sympathy. I wasn't supporting them, but I sympathized with their wishes and hopes. I'm very glad that it didn't happen, and I'm pretty happy that we don't hear much about that option anymore. Canada is a fantastically wonderful country. I can't imagine living anywhere else, but I also can't imagine living anywhere but Montreal. I couldn't live in a place, a city, a town, what have you, that didn't have French. It's become one of my basic needs.
This from a girl that was born in Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan.
Yeah, well, I had no say in that. My parents took me away when I was only 2.
Yeah.
But, you know, I always loved studying French, although I didn't major in it at university. But I had one teacher in particular in my first year of French at University College. His name is David Hayne. He was a scholar. He wrote scholarly books. And when I was inducted into the Order of Canada, he was too. And, I mean, there was no relationship between the two, obviously. But I was so thrilled. Well, first I was thrilled to see him again after all those years. And then I was shocked to realize that he should have had it 25 years ago and hadn't. That, I mean, he was one of the teachers who started me on this path. It's ending up in the Plateau Montreal.
Well, the Order of Canada, that's what it's there for, is to recognize the kind of work that you've done throughout your career, and thank you for that, and thank you for taking the time to talk to me.
Thank you for taking the time to ask me some very good questions. I've enjoyed meeting you and sitting around this table, and I hope I didn't make too many gaffes.
Not at all.
I hope I might have said a few things that are amusing, because I like to entertain.
Definitely. Thanks very much again.
Thank you.
I've been speaking with Sheila Fischman, who is an award-winning translator of some 200 contemporary novels from Quebec.